Welcome everyone. I'm Evelyn Lim, the Director of Policy and Research at the American Cornerstone Institute. Thank you for joining us today for our Cornerstone conversation. It's National Police Week, and so this conversation will focus on law enforcement and the important dialogue happening in our nation surrounding police reform. President Biden has asked for legislation before the end of May. However, while some agreements have been made, Congress still has a ways to go. And talks are continuing this week as key components are still unresolved, such as qualified immunity and how to prosecute police misconduct under Section 242 of Title 18. Senator Tim Scott, who is leading the Republican efforts in the Senate, said he was reasonably optimistic that an agreement could be made on the bill. So we will be watching very carefully over the next few weeks. So today we are excited to have Chief James Crag with us.
How you doing? Great to be here.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Chief Crag began his 44-year law enforcement career with the Detroit Police Department in January 1977. 28 of those years, he served in the Los Angeles Police Department, as well as Chief of Police for the Portland, Maine Police Department and Cincinnati, Ohio Police Department, before returning to Detroit in July 2013 as the 42nd Chief of Police for the Detroit Police Department. There he leads a department of over 2,000 sworn and civilian personnel. Chief Crag is known throughout his career for building strong community partnerships, increasing productivity and performance among the force, and significant changes and improvements in organizational structures and processes. Just yesterday, he announced his retirement from the police department, effective June 1st. Thanks again, Chief Crag, for joining us, and thank you so much for your public service.
Oh, thank you so much.
Today.
All right, appreciate it.
And of course, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Carson, coincidentally also from Detroit and founder and chairman of ACI. Dr. Carson, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Evelyn. And I just want to thank Chief Crag for the outstanding job that he's been doing in my hometown. You know, there aren't very many cities these days where you have a stellar chief of police, or at least one who's assumed to be stellar, who's really reasonable and logical, not extreme on either side, and is very much interested in what police are supposed to do, and that's maintain the peace and safety of the community. And it will be fascinating to hear from such an individual as this conversation deepens, not only here at Cornerstone, but throughout the nation, about police reform, police techniques, what can be done, what should be done. You know, there is a certain degree of unfairness to the accusations that are made about police, because if there's one bad police officer and he does something, you know, it's like a smear on all of them. But we don't necessarily do that, you know, for doctors or for bus drivers or for airline pilots. It's only for police that we seem to do that. And that really doesn't make any sense at all when you consider when those officers get up in the morning and put that uniform on and they go out the door, they don't know if they're coming back. Their family doesn't know if they're coming back. Every time that telephone rings during the day, that spouse, the heart jumps up into their throat. I mean, we owe a great debt to the individuals who are willing to do that. And particularly these days with so much criticism. You know, I was fortunate when I was in college to have a job with the Yale police force.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, I carried the walkie-talkie. And of course, when it would go off, all the students would say, "There's a spy in here." But we had a wonderful time. We were able to solve some bikes, theft rings, and all kinds of things like that. So the police are an integral part, obviously, of any society that is stable and functioning. If you want to make a society unstable and create chaos, then get rid of the police.
Chief Crag, you started in the 1970s in Detroit after the Detroit riots. Tell us a little bit how that impacted you going into the police force and a little bit more about your background.
Well, you know, that's a great way to start. You know, I was 19 years old when I went to the Detroit Police Academy. That wasn't my life goal. In fact, I matriculated at a high school, and I know Dr. Carson knows Cass Technical High.
Oh, yeah. A
And I
techie.
was, oh yeah. And so I was majoring in automotive technology and wanted to be an engineer. And so after graduation, I started to attend Lawrence Tech to pursue a degree in mechanical engineering. But I realized in short order that while I had a passion for automotive engineering and design, I was being called as a public servant. You know, my dad, who served in the military as a military police officer, and when I was just 10 or 11 years old, when the Detroit unrest broke, he was a police reserve. Then it wasn't many African Americans working in the Detroit Police Department. In fact, it was largely Caucasian. However, uh, uh, you know, the police department, I mean, the city was becoming increasingly African American. So the first African American mayor then decided, it was kind of a novel concept. I mean, he was forward thinking in that way that, you know, it was a lot of problems between police and community. I mean, this was on the heels of civil unrest just 10 years earlier. And so by integrating the police department, what happened, he wanted to put police officers in the neighborhoods who could build relationships with community members, like trust-based relationships. And so I was part of that. And it was interesting because I was met with discrimination as this young police officer. Even at one point thought about resigning, but instead of resigning, I was encouraged by my dad to stay connected in law enforcement if I really want to be part of change. But I will tell you, that was the best advice he gave me. My dad, after he got out of the Army, applied for the Detroit Police Department, and it was rare that African Americans were being hired. And so he always had a passion to be a public servant. And again, serving in the military, U.S. Army as a military police officer. So it was the right decision, but I was faced with discrimination. And I went on and, but my first night in a car, my partner, who was white, probably had 25 years on, he looked at me and says, "I don't want you here." He said, "I'm not going to talk to you. You're not going to drive the car, and you can just do nothing." And that was shocking. Imagine by now I was 20 years old. I mean, is this what this profession is like? And I really thought hard, long and hard. And again, I'm glad I stayed. As things would have it, I got laid off. And while Coleman Young hired a lot of police officers during the 70s and 80s, because he wanted to staff up, because the city was planning, they were hosting the Republican National Convention in 1980. So at the conclusion of the convention in August of 1980, he laid off 1,500 police officers. Now, of course, that was a time when Detroit's population was about 1.5, 1.6, fifth largest city. Police department's staffing strength was about 6,500. And so I had to make a decision. I got laid off. By that time, you know, I really loved the profession and I wanted to continue. So I had two choices: Toledo, Ohio, which was hiring, or Los Angeles, California. Of course, when I thought about Toledo, I thought about the climate. And I said, I might as well, I said, if I stay in Toledo, when Detroit ever calls back, I can just go home. It's 45 minutes from Detroit. But I made a better decision. I moved west, didn't know anyone, and I ended up staying out in the in Los Angeles in the LAPD for almost 28 years. Rose through the ranks, but I really wanted to pursue my career goal of becoming a chief of police. And so my first job as chief of police again was Portland, Maine. And a lot of folks say, "Well, how do you leave Los Angeles and then go to Portland, Maine?" I'd never been to Portland, Maine. And if I had a lot of time, I could go into the reasons why. But I stayed there for 2 years. Really, we did some wonderful things in that city. And then the Cincinnati opportunity opened up, and Cincinnati had never had an outside police chief. They had had their issues. They had civil unrest. I want to say in the 2000s, and this was on the heels of African-American men being shot by the Cincinnati Police Department. And so I came after that. I came after they were under federal oversight. And so again, first outside, first African-American chief, stayed there 2 years. Great run. Still have many friends there, as I do in Portland, Maine. But then the ultimate opportunity opened up, and that was coming home, coming full circle. And as you indicated, in July 2013. But what was interesting about Detroit at the time, it was going through and facing bankruptcy. It did go through bankruptcy. An emergency manager took control of the city at the direction of the state. The state basically took control of the city of Detroit for a lot of reasons. So one of the things that they wanted to do was find a chief of police who wasn't from Detroit, not in the manner I was from Detroit, but someone who could, institute cultural change. Detroit PD had been under federal oversight for probably 12, 13 years. Morality department was at the very bottom. We talk about defund the police right now. Detroit was defunded before the bankruptcy because the police officers lost 10% of their pay. They were forced into 12-hour shifts. So, and widely reported that the response times to emergency calls were well over an hour. And so all recipes for disaster. And then on the other side, you had the community that basically had lost confidence in the police department. So I looked at the opportunity, and people in Cincinnati thought I was losing my mind to even consider it, but I was going home. And so I did accept the position. And I got to tell you now, over 8 years, while it was a rough beginning, we've done some wonderful things about changing culture in the city relative to policing, building trust-based relationships in the community, transparency, really brought to the table some innovative ideas. I know Dr. Carson probably heard of our Green Light Detroit. We built a real-time crime center that was state-of-the-art, only to rival New York. We started a neighborhood policing program I brought called NPOs, Neighborhood Police Officers, which has received rave reviews. And so a lot of that, and then dealing with corruption type issues, I hired a former U.S. attorney to lead my professional standards section. That was another way of garnering trust in the community. And then lastly, and it's a lot more, but Detroit as one of the major cities, I know factually we have probably more women in leadership positions in Detroit than any other major city. I'm talking about at the rank of captain and above. And so it's a testament to what we're doing. As you know, and I know it comes up a lot when I'm on the national stage. People talk about 2020, cities, major cities that burned, looting, and police officers retreating, violent protesters that took over city blocks and called them autonomous zones. That didn't happen in Detroit. And many predicted if any place was going to burn, Detroit would have probably been the first, given its history dating back to 1967. But because of our relationship in the community, we were able to stall the outside agitators that were trying to come in and incite riotous behavior. And so I'm very proud of the work of the men and women in the department. It's bittersweet that I've announced my retirement. Again, imagine I've been doing this all my adult life. But it's time to consider other options. I'm passionate about what I see as undermining and certainly destroying law enforcement as we know it. What's sad today when we talk about defunding, demobilizing police departments, these people who speak out do not speak out for people who live in vulnerable neighborhoods. I know people who live in the neighborhoods here in Detroit. They want ethical constitutional policing. They want the police department. They respect this department. And so when people who are elected to sit in seats, and I don't call seats of leadership, but seats of influence, and they spew reckless statements that undermine the fabric of what we know as order is shameful. So I know I've talked for a while, and I'll certainly open it up for any other comments.
Well, I think we certainly don't need less police. We need more
Right.
police, because the concept that you've talked about in the past, community policing, is really one of the keys, I think, to solving the problem. I was talking to a police officer in Baltimore, and he said he walks the same beat every day, knows everybody there. They all know him. He says he never has to buy lunch because people are always inviting him in for lunch. But,
Right.
you know, when something's going on, he knows it. He knows that things are not right, and people are not reluctant to talk to him. And
Right.
I think that makes all the difference in the world. You begin to establish that trust. But I'm also interested in your thoughts on new technologies that are available to police so that you can use non-lethal force. Have you seen any that you feel would be particularly useful? Because I know police officers been taught that you shoot to kill, you don't shoot to maim, you don't shoot them in the leg, you don't shoot them in the arm. But sometimes the infraction may not be of such nature that you actually want to kill somebody, but you also want to be able to apprehend them. What do you think about those?
Well, you bring up a good point, and there's so much, and I hate to use this thing, shoot to kill. Police officers use deadly force to address a imminent threat to life. And when you're talking about an imminent threat to life, that's when an officer can use deadly force. It's only when it becomes excessive. When we look at the case involving George Floyd and the Chauvin, the officer who murdered George Floyd, clearly excessive force. I probably was one of the police chiefs in America that stood up and said after watching the video that the Minneapolis Police Department should have, arrested the officer based on probable cause to believe that the crime of murder did happen. That's what police officers do. We respond to crime scenes. We make a determination whether the suspect or probable cause exists to make the arrest. And when you don't make the arrest, it tends to foster the perception that the police are treated differently. They're not fostering a trust-based environment. So when we talk about, well, why couldn't we just shoot them in the leg? When an officer uses deadly force, it's to stop an imminent threat to life. So a lot of things get bannered around. I mean, I heard this at some Oscars award show, some actor spewed that, 3 people are shot and killed a day by police. So what does that really mean? When an officer uses deadly force, should we then say, like some elected politicians say, we're sick and tired of police violence? But if an officer uses deadly force and it was lawful, that's not police violence. I'm sorry. And this is the thing that it's how we say it. George Floyd, absolutely police violence. So let's talk about what recently happened in Columbus, Ohio, where the teenager was armed with a knife. The officer got a call, and in the call, the people calling articulated that there was this armed teenager with a knife, and she was threatening, or something to that effect. The officer gets there, he sees the teenager, she's got a knife, and she's lunging toward another teenager, a potential victim, and the officer, in a matter of a split second, makes a decision to use deadly force to stop that threat. So immediately, people like LeBron gets in Twitterverse, and he makes a knee-jerk statement that you're next. In other words, comparing the police violence that happened in Minneapolis to what happened in Columbus. That's the problem we have today in America, where it's not properly articulated. And I know we have such a divide right now But we're never going to get past this unless we start really giving police departments an opportunity to properly have an investigation. Police officers have a right to due process. I mean, I understand the emotion tied. One unlawful shooting by a police officer is just one too many. I get it. I've certainly built a reputation on not only transparency, but when there's an illegal act by an officer, I will never hesitate to take action.
And when you consider how many interactions there are between police and citizens every day,
Hundreds and thousands.
It's incredible. And
Right.
but we have a media today that focuses on that one incident that will bolster their argument that everything is racist. You know, if the police officer in Columbus had been a racist, when he arrived, he would say, "Oh, it's just two black women killing each other. I don't care." That would have been the racist response. It wouldn't have been trying to save somebody.
We don't even talk about the life saving. We don't talk about the fact that he saved a life.
Right. Exactly. Now, is it because I hear a lot of people saying, you know, we need to deploy social workers and other types of people to these areas where there's domestic violence. It seems to me from the statistics that I've read that those are some of the most dangerous situations.
Absolutely, they are. And more so now because of the pandemic. Now, I'm not saying there is not a place for deploying social workers into a domestic situation. So by example, an officer maybe handles a call of a domestic incident. There was no violence, no arrest, but clearly there's some issues in the home between two people. This is an opportunity to have social workers come in, build a relationship, certainly maintain, and we've done some of that here in Detroit. There is value in that, but when you talk about defunding and then moving funds into social service programs, I think there needs to be funding, additional funding, or better management of funds allocated to servicing those suffering from mental illness. I absolutely believe that. I believe social workers can augment what police officers do. But to make reckless statements like the mayor in Brooklyn Center said, well, I think if officers make traffic stops, they should do so unarmed. That's absurd. There is no routine traffic stop. And as many guns as we get out of cars by individuals carrying guns, it's a very dangerous activity at times. We know that definitively, but to make these reckless comments that are just trying to appease a group, because again, the whole notion is let's just dismantle policing. We don't need them.
Well, let me ask you a question that many would consider controversial, but which is circulating everywhere these days. Is there in the United States systemic racism in police departments? Because you've had a chance to see several police departments.
I have. Well, let me start by answering it this way. First of all, once again, that's a broad brush. So what you're saying that systemically in every police department across this country, there's systemic racism. So we don't address the fact that there are white officers who work in challenging or impoverished neighborhoods to abate violent crime, and sometimes they make the ultimate sacrifice. Broad brushing the entire profession is just flatly wrong. Now, are there racist individuals inside of policing? Absolutely. I'd say that, but that doesn't mean it's systemic. Are there departments in the country that have a pattern and practice of engaging in activities that are discriminatory? I would say yes. So maybe that department is systemically racist, but to just broad brush the entire profession, it's just a knee-jerk response to say what? Another reason why we should dismantle the profession and not support the vast majority who do the job right. Or how about the many white, black, brown officers that after shooting a suspect when they were faced with an imminent threat, they transitioned very quickly from a warrior mode into one of a lifesaver. Put them in the back seat of a police car and transport this person who seconds ago tried to murder them. That has happened many times here in Detroit.
Mhm. Well, on the question of qualified immunity, obviously we need to be able to have police officers able to do their job without second guessing everything that they do. I think a lot of people are going to get killed, a lot of police officers, if they have to second guess everything they do. What's the fair position to take on the whole issue of qualified immunity?
I call it the only position is that do not remove qualified immunity from police officers. If you do, you will see a mass exodus of police officers across this country. You're certainly not going to hire the best who would want to be a police officer.
Right.
And so basically, I call it a veiled effort, a strategy to once again dismantle. Let's talk about what's happening in New York right now. The City Council of New York voted to end qualified immunity for NYPD. 75% increase in attrition and compared to this time last year. They are leaving in large numbers. So what you are doing, even though now there are some are trying to back off the whole notion of defund, but when you remove qualified immunity, you're basically dismantling a police department. And let's face it, defund policing is a precursor, in my judgment, to dismantling.
Have you seen any place where getting rid of police has resulted in a better situation? I can't think of any offhand.
Well, I got to tell you, when you look at the rate of crime in all of our major cities, certainly my old home of Los Angeles, NYPD, Portland, the violent crime rate is out the roof. You got judges who are public servants who call themselves reforming the bail program, and it's an absolute failure. There's no independent judgment. We had a female sergeant, by way of example, who was murdered by her estranged child's father. He was arrested shortly after. This was in 2019. And so probably within the last month, he, based on compassionate release and the fact that this individual is entitled to a speedy trial because he's been waiting for trial since 2019, released him out of custody. And I got to tell you, this was so wrong. I've never heard it. Second degree, premeditated murder, released from custody. So the message today is simple. The criminals are emboldened because they know that between the anti-police rhetoric, the posture that the courts are taking, no longer is it about the victims. No one wants to talk about the victims or their families. Everything, whether it's the use of certain technology, everything is more focused on the violent criminal. And I'm all about protecting the rights of those who commit crimes. You know, if you want to engage in bail reform and somebody is a drug abuser who's incarcerated or who sells drugs and they don't have a history of violence, let them out. Put them on some type of structured probation. I'm okay with that, particularly if they had, you know, not a series of events, criminal events that constitute violence. Let them out. But I'm talking about shooters, individuals who are very dangerous, sociopaths. Is that what we really want to do now?
Obviously not. And it's almost like we've lost our minds. I'm hoping that this is just a temporary phase that we're
But we
going
need
through.
strong leadership who sit
Yeah,
in seats of influence and leadership, because there are people who sit in seats of influence who make reckless statements, eliminate policing, eliminate incarceration. Then U.S. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib backed off of her comments, tried to soften it because she understood the reckless nature of them. This is the
yeah.
people we have sitting in seats of influence.
Well, those are the very people who want police protection too.
Exactly.
It's so
It's
crazy.
hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy.
One of the things that I was just thinking of is you talk about this the morale of officers and, which affects their health and wellness and can endanger performance. What can we as community members do to really support our police departments and our officers in the community?
When you look at the departments that are failing because officers who don't feel supported in part are leaving. In Detroit, our officers don't make the highest pay among some of the other police agencies. But, one of the things that they have said, and it was a very emotional day yesterday, many were sad that I was leaving because they knew I was going to stand up and support the ones who do it right in a very bold way. When others sit down and are quiet, say nothing, people who sit in seats of influence, they know I will do it. And not only do I do it on a local level, but when I have the opportunity to go on a national stage and talk about why it's important to support police officers. I was in Chicago a couple of weekends ago, met with a few Chicago police officers. The morale is at the very bottom. They know that the mayor does not support them. They know that the chief of police there basically is beholden to the mayor and says very little in support of them. So it's like they're on their own. And they're leaving in very large numbers. So what the community needs to do is not sit back idly by, demand that people who are public servants do what's right, speak on behalf of law enforcement, because this profession is in a crisis right now.
Absolutely. And I always say to people, when you see a police officer, please thank them. My wife and I, wherever we are, if we see a police officer, we thank them for what they're doing and the danger that they go through every day. And, you have to really think these things through. The reason that God gave us these big brains is we can think these things through. If we create a situation where police are resigning all over the place, what's the next step? The next step is you have to bring in the military. And all of a sudden you start transitioning to a police state or a military state. That's not America. That's the place that people fought and died for.
Well, they complain about the militarization of police, but this is a way to dismantle government as we come to know it. And it's an agenda. We know that. And that's why when you look at last summer, call it the Summer of Love, in some of these cities, this was a very coordinated effort around this country, because I watched with intensity. I studied it. I saw similar characteristics of what was going on in terms of trying to promote violence. They tried here too. They just could not get the traction. And so that's why building trusting relationships in your community should not start when something bad happens. Rather, it should be institutionalized in the fabric of that police department.
Absolutely. Well, Chief Craig, I hope that we're going to see a lot of you in leadership positions in this nation. I mean, we need people who are logical, who have common sense, and who actually care about the people as public servants. And we want to thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And also want to thank you for the opportunity to come on your video and share some of my thoughts. And certainly, as I get close to my retirement date, which is in a few short weeks, after that, I'll be making some sort of announcement of what the next phase of public service looks like.
Good. You'll be like me, fail retirement. It's okay.
Right.
Well, thank you both
Well,
for
thank you.
spending time with us, and we will stay tuned, Chief, like the rest of America, to hear what's next.
Okay.
Thank you for your leadership, and
Thank you
please
so
thank
much.
everybody at your department on behalf of us for their public service.
I sure will. Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much, and
All right.
we'll talk soon.